Hello and welcome back to Paper Mountains Podcast. This is Jake Welly, and with this being a completely free-form style of podcast with no set rules, duration, or expectation, I'm trying something new here. Right now with us traveling, this is going to be an audio-only podcast, and I've been reading a lot, and one book that I finished a few weeks ago just really captured my attention, had me thinking a lot, and just kind of wanted me to spurt out my string of consciousness and thoughts upon finishing the book. And that book was The Fourth Turning by William Strauss and Neil Howe. With this episode, I'm just going to kind of go through my notes and highlights and try to summarize my thoughts as best as I can to just try to convey how I'm feeling and what my thoughts were reading the book. It's kind of, I don't know if it's necessarily going to be a book review, but it's just going to summarize some points that I highlighted that seem to be impactful on my way of thinking or the way I'm going to go forward and looking at the world. So the full title of the book is The Fourth Turning, An American Prophecy: What the Cycles of History Tell Us About America's Next Rendezvous with Destiny. The book was originally published in 1997 by the two authors, again, William Strauss and Neil Howe. To follow along with this podcast, all of the book notes and associated links are included in the show notes below. So let's get into it. First, who is William Strauss and Neil Howe? It seems like a big majority of their career has been focused on understanding generations and how generations are formed and how that affects culture. This book has been on my radar for probably a few years now after hearing some people talk about it in media on other podcasts, and I finally sat down to read it over the course of the past 4 weeks because it is a dense read and there's a ton to digest, and there's multiple times where I had to go back and reread certain sections or chapters just to try to make sure I was understanding the theories correctly. So what is The Fourth Turning? What is this book about? How could I summarize this in a few sentences? So The Fourth Turning is exactly what it implies, is that there's 4 quarters to a cycle of time, with each cycle beginning while Americans are having and living in a euphoric, optimistic state of life that ultimately ends over the course of roughly 100 years, with a major crisis of which is overcome and then the cycle restarts. And the way that Strauss and Howe categorize these 4 turnings are through a high, an awakening, an unraveling, and a crisis. Through this statement, the theory is that this full saculum has happened throughout all of America's history. The book goes into great detail on each of the past saculums. Initially, there's the Reformation period that had the awakening in 1536 that ultimately resulted in the Armada Crisis of 1588. The New World saculum that had the Puritan awakening in 1640 that ended with the Glorious Revolution in 1689. Next, there was a Revolutionary period that had the Great Awakening in 1741 that ultimately ended with the American Revolution in 1781. The next was the Civil War period that had the Transcendental Awakening in 1831 that ended with the Civil War in 1863. And most recently, the Great Power Saculum started with the Third Great Awakening in 1896 and ended with the crisis, the Great Depression, and World War II. And most currently, the Millennial Saculum that had the awakening known as the Conscious Revolution of 1974, and to what is predicted the Millennial Crisis of 2025. Long story short, for why I believe the book was written, they were trying to make a prediction that the next American crisis was around the corner. And given that the book's theory and timing of these quarters, it is stating that the crisis in American culture will reach its breaking point by like 2023, 2024, 2025. So right now in history, this is kind of the main reason why I started reading the book, because I wanted to read what the predictions were 30 years ago and what we should be expecting right around the corner. I was ultimately curious as to see if these predictions were warranted or if there was any truth in this crazy fourth turning theory. So I had a lot of thoughts. I had some disagreements with the book given the timing and the state of where I think America is in history right now, and why I don't think that we're necessarily completely aligned with this target. But there's a part of me that also does believe and has this sense of feeling that there might be a major crisis right around the corner. I'm not trying to project or have some sort of fear-mongering statement here. Again, this is just me trying to spurt out my thoughts and trying for myself just to understand how I feel about this book and how I feel about this theory, because it is compelling, and I do think it is a very impactful and can be impactful on the way people live their lives on an everyday basis. Because the book is more than just a theory, at its core, I think it just provides helpful insights on how to live your life and how you should be interacting within it. So I'm going to go into the book. I'm going to look at my notes that I have typed out here and then just kind of provide my own unique perspective on the book's topics. Hopefully it makes somewhat of a cohesive narrative by the end of this, and that it can be consumed in a way that is thought-provoking and also engaging for somebody listening to this. So thank you for listening, and let's go into it. Right off at the beginning of the book, it is stated that we learn history all wrong, that kind of in Western culture and from America exceptionalism, we started looking at history linearly in the last 200 years following the Industrial Revolution. And that is mainly because of basically for the last how many generations, we've always looked at the world as continuously improving. What is trying to convey in this book is that that's not the best way of looking at history, because we're looking at it all wrong from a sequence of events that just go linearly down a line. For example, to picture something in your head would be a timeline. We've all witnessed it from front to end. This implies that there's a beginning and an ultimate end to history, which that might be the case, but all of history is not continuously improving from the beginning of time to the end of time. It is certainly possible that our understanding of history is just not entirely accurate. History is often written by the victors, and there can be biases and omissions in the way that it is recorded and passed down. Additionally, new information and perspectives can come to light over time that may change or complicate our understanding of the past. It is important to approach the study of history with an open and critical mindset, and to consider multiple sources and perspectives. We should try to unlearn the linear belief that the modern world is exempt from the seasonal cycles of nature. Winston Churchill once said, "The further backward you look, the further forward you are likely to see." In other words, as Eddard Stark said, winter is coming. Over the course of all of humans, there have been three major ways developed about thinking about time. The original view was chaotic, where the primitive man looked at as everything in nature is chaos. There's no understanding, everything happens at random, and everything is happening and just occurring, and no grasp of a greater movement. Through the development of human societies, ancient and traditional civilizations started to look at the world cyclically. There was a lot of equilibriums between the physical world and the afterworld. And then eventually with modern society, we looked at it linearly from start to finish. And this book strives to get people to look at the world maybe more cyclically and look at history in the same manner. Not necessarily religiously, but there is some sort of cycle to be had with human development. Because we should be looking at history in a more nuanced manner to maybe understand what direction we are headed for the future. And this starts to kind of warp a linear projection of history to this fourth turning theory of more of a secular view on history. And right off the bat, they provide some evidence to show like this is somehow ingrained in us, because in a way, human culture and generational temperament acts in the same way as nature. There is a saeculum to our mentality as a species, because we're not exempt from the seasonal cycles of nature. To quote the book directly, it says, "Without plant death, weeds would strangle the forest. Without human death, memories would never die, and unbroken habits and customs would strangle civilizations." In a way, we need to have moments that aren't always improving, that aren't always bettering, to reflect on regrowth and redirection to start anew. So what are the four turnings? Again, each turning lasts roughly 20 to 25 years. First, we have the high sentiment, and then we enter the awakening period, then an unraveling time, until finally we reach a time of crisis. And then we'll get into the more details of these quarters and how generations are intertwined with these. And it's very clear that Strauss and Howe have done an incredible amount of research in producing this theory because they reference and understand earlier developed theories from past philosophers and scientists that exist in the same vein as this book to produce this greater narrative of American culture and American history. And to start off, we've looked at things in saeculums and quarters all the time, whether it's nature coming from winter, spring, summer, and fall, to compare other topics and studies all encompassing a 4-part structure: wet, hot, dry, and cold. The Jungian function, where it has reason, intuition, feeling, and sensation. The Thomson social function, which has the king, the artist, the priest, and soldier. And what the authors realized here is that these 4-part identifications are all the same thing when viewed together. This is how Strauss and Howe created an all-encompassing description of American generational archetypes, making the same argument that the 4 types of the main character traits, each uniquely assigned to each generation, each one specifically aligned in accordance to when and where they were born, to how they end up playing out their roles within each turning during their lifespan, in any view of nature, societies, culture, etc. Again, in this theory, there are 4 generational archetypes, and they are: first is the hero, and they are an outer-driven, optimistic person. The next archetype is an artist, and they describe them as being emotionally expressive. The third type is a prophet. This type of person is inner-driven and often pessimistic. And finally, we have the nomad. They're emotionally reserved. Each one of these generational archetypes is what we would call a generation. Everybody's familiar with Gen X, Millennial, Boomer. These terms have been rejuvenated through pop culture and how we look at people in our everyday lives. But this book tries to dive deeper than the surface level analysis of how we group people together based on their age. It's much deeper than that. We all have personality traits that were nurtured into us from a young age because of the current major events and where culture was at that time. This book emphasizes this point with a very profound statement. It stated that history creates generations and generations create history. History creates generations and generations create history. If generational personalities are seasonal, then that means that history, it has to be seasonal as well. There's some sort of symbiosis between life and time. So when looking at the saeculum of time with generations, the theory proposed here is that a prophet generation will be born during a high. This is the time of peace, post-war. People feel refreshed with time, and there's a major optimism in the air. Through the course of life, and 20 to 25 years later, the nomad generation will be born during an awakening. This is the second quarter. There might be some mini wars, some small changing and questioning of the newfound order, but ultimately there's still an optimism in the air. The third quarter will arise 50 to 60 years down the line, and the hero generation is born during an unraveling, during the third quarter. This is where there's general peace, but there might be some more wars coming up or fighting where people are really questioning the authority, and there's just a feeling of unease and uncertainty because the guidance and direction of the country isn't strong. People have developed super strong individuality. People are losing sense of the collective greater good for America. And finally, the fourth quarter. An artist generation is born during the crisis. This is a major war. This is a major event. This is a global that's going to completely reorganize and shift the saeculum and start over. Pending the outcome of this war or event will redirect and re-guide the collective unit of American culture to restart the first quarter. This book ultimately turned the way I view generations upside down, because generational references are always bombarded with us through TV, movies, political understandings, even memes, where the whole Gen Z and millennial culture has been clowning on the boomer generation. Or like TV documentaries where it's where like Kurt Cobain was the voice of Generation X. What is really trying to be conveyed with this book is trying to provide more of a profound connection that each generation has to nature and time, more so than what a generation has with the lyrics of a song or to how they look at politics. And I found this really intriguing to want to understand more because I do identify with the millennial generation, and I want to understand what that means to my personality and the greater collective for the human history. Where does my piece of the puzzle fall in this grand time scheme of history? Because generally we all know that we're going to be forgotten and only few people will represent our time and place in history. So how does my voice or my thoughts fit into that? And it really made me want to learn more and dive deeper into this book because there's no fixed formula for identifying the persona of our generation. Strauss and Howe say that it's helpful to look at 3 attributes. First, a generation's common location in history. Next, finding out the generation's common beliefs and behavior. And third, its perceived membership of the common generation. So maybe while you're listening to this podcast, if you haven't read the book, or if you have read the book and you just want to try to reanalyze your thoughts as well, think about this on a personal level. Where do you think you belong? Think about your traits and think about your personality and how you view the world, and maybe question what you've developed throughout your life up to this point. Because nobody can choose what generation and time of culture that we're born into and how we are raised and nurtured. Throughout the course of your early development in your life, you're going to be nurtured from past generations, which will ultimately develop the way that you look at the world around you. To reinforce the idea of the 4 turnings, we're going to look at everything in quarters. For simplicity's sake, everything is 25 years. Throughout the course of your life, you're going to have 4 internal lifespans that you live. A childhood, a young adult life, midlife, and elderhood. Along these same 25-year spans, the generation will reach its full saculum, with having its first turning a high for 25 years, a second turning for 25 years, which is the awakening, the third turning for 25 years, the unraveling, and a fourth turning, a crisis for 25 years. And when you look at it, these 2 pieces, this is why there's different generational categories, because the whole mood of the larger culture is going to shift how each generation acts and perceives the culture around them. As we continue this podcast, I want you to personally think about your generation and how you perceive the world, and also think of people you know or people you're connected to, and try to reflect on what generation they're a part of to see if you start to see any distinct differences in personality traits or views of the world in general. This isn't going to work on every personal basis, and nor should it, because it's trying to convey that generations are much more impactful as a collective than they are as the individual. But it might be interesting to see, think, or ponder about how someone you might know in your personal life lives in a different generation or a different perspective, and you might come to a better understanding of the other person, of why they might have a different view than you, or to maybe bridge that gap to understanding why they might view the world differently. So I'm going to go into what are the 5 of the living generations in Americas. That way you can understand some of these characteristics and see where you are in history, or where your parents might lie, or where grandparents, or for your own kids for the future. And then following the descriptions of these 5 generations, I'm going to go back and discuss some of the moods of each turning and how each generation interacts with the current moods of each turning. I hope this makes sense. I hope it doesn't sound like I'm just rambling in circles too much, because that's how I felt a little bit while I was reading this book. For the most recent American history, the last crisis was 1929 to 1945. I think everybody listening to this can place what was the major crisis that ended that turning. Obviously, it was World War II. Completely affected everybody's lives and the way Americans viewed the world. But the artist was born during this time period, because they weren't a part of World War II other than a child looking up at all of the adults playing this game. So this was the silent generation, which is mostly going to be the living elders today, the oldest people alive, the grandparents and great-grandparents of the later generations. And these artists are known as the silent generation. Following the World War II crisis, in 1946, we have the new American high, and so starts the next generation. The boomers, which were born from 1946 to 1964. This is the new prophet generation. The characteristics of an American high has these prophets that are growing up increasingly indulged from the post-crisis. There is a wave of economy. America is booming right now. So this generation was born with the best indulgences that you can have in American history. Everybody was optimistic. The war was over, and this childhood has no first-hand connection to World War II. So as the prophet generation proceeds through life, they come of age as potentially narcissistic young crusaders, is what's described in the book, during the next awakening. This then cultivates the prophet boomers to have a moralistic midlife journey, and then emerges as the wise elders in the next crisis. So that leads us to the American Awakening, 1965 to 1984. This is when the Gen X, or also described as the 13th generation, is born. The Gen X characteristic traits are known as nomads. Nomads grow up in an underprotected childhood during the awakening. This is mainly because the boomers, which a lot of people don't equate to the boomer generation, is that these were the young hippies in the 1960s. They were coming of age in their spiritual awakening and focused very much internally on themselves. As the next generation of nomads were being born, there might have been a feeling of neglect because the older generation was very much focused on their own individuality and less focused on raising the next generation. So this creates a generation of nomads that maybe felt alienated as young adults. The voice of Kurt Cobain, which represented this coming of age. So they are young adults in the post-awakening world. As the nomads age, they become maybe pragmatic midlife leaders during the next crisis and age as the post-crisis elders. This leads us to my generation, what I identify with, the Millennial Generation, 1985 to 2000. This is America's unraveling period, and what I will later discuss how I potentially have some disagreements with. The Millennials are labeled as the hero generation. We grew up in an increasingly protected post-awakening children. The nomads who felt potentially rejected in their childhood reject this idea and overcompensate with the millennials to overprotect them and maybe shelter them from the harsh realities that they were witnessing as children. As the millennials are coming of age in the 2010s to the 2020s, and this is what is predicted because remember, this book was published in 1996. So the prediction was that the millennials would be a heroic young team workers during the crisis. They will all come together and be the strongest collective generation to help America through their next crisis as the young adults. This brings us to being predicted as a hubris and an energetic midlifers, and then will emerge as the powerful elders who will be attacked by the next awakening period later in American history. And finally, this leads us to the most recent born generation, the next artist generation, who will align directly with the characteristics of the silent generation born during World War II, the Gen Zers born from 2000 to roughly 2025, during what is described as the current American crisis. It's described that the artist generation will grow up completely overprotected during the crisis because America has lost itself and the children are being the most protected children. Everybody wants to make sure that this generation will not follow in their footsteps. It is described that the artist generation will then come of age as sensitive young adults in a post-crisis world, and then eventually break free as indecisive midlifers during the next awakening, and then will age into emphatic post-awakening elders. I know that this might feel like a lot of information to digest in a short period of time. If it feels like too much, then I recommend pausing the podcast and maybe reflecting on what was just stated in the last 10 minutes. There's a lot to digest, and maybe try to focus on thinking about who are the people in your life who identify with these generations and how you might agree or disagree. Do you feel like there might be the prophets? Do you feel like a nomad? The hero generation of millennials is why this may be or may not be the case. And then we can proceed further into diving deeper into this topic. And remember that very important statement that I said at the beginning of this podcast. History creates generations, and generations create history. There's a belief that we're connected to the social structure of the world around us, and how we identify it with each period of our life and each turning of the saculum. Now let's go into further detail on the last American high, awakening, and unraveling to help create an understanding to the author's prediction of today's crisis age. What sentiments, attitudes, and actions of the 1900s could possibly lead to the next American crisis, the last of which was post-World War II. The description of the next 20 years after 1945 can be described as a unified social structure with a simple worldview. This is where the American dream came of age. During the American high, because many of the midlifers who fought in World War II just wanted an easier life and were very satisfied with working for their everyday jobs to have a maximum community around them. This is where there was commonality. People were fine with living in the same style of houses and the white picket fence with the same size yard. This generation was just very content because they realized the harsh realities of what war brought to the world. They had a very bright future because they feel like they just went through what has been the hardest, which is most likely has been the hardest time in that generation's life that anybody could recall. The second turning the awakening, the culture might feel more passionate and start attacking institutions and norms. And as we just discussed, this is the prophet boomer generation and their young adulthood experimenting with psychedelics, spiritual journeys that is questioning the established norm. There is rising individualism and more of a start of breaking of the community sense and the social priority. And the worldview is starting to be more complicated because there's a lot of different perspectives that are arising out of this generation. Up next, we have the third turning, again, the unraveling. So we have our boomers, prophets who are entering midlife now. We have our young nomads, 13er Gen X generation, and the childhood hero millennials. This is when the book was written, where the author felt that there was the maximum individualism in culture. We are completely divided from the boomers leading this culture war because of so many individual takes and perspectives on the world. The whole world seems eroded. There was many economic crises, and now the adults are feeling more hopeless about the future. I don't know if this is the sentiment of the 80s and 90s, but it would be interesting to hear more of a perspective of adults who lived during this period if this is how their generation felt. And what is most interesting, the prediction of the book, the current crisis of what we're supposedly in today. This is where the belief is that American foundations and culture is reuniting. People are starting to fight the individuality and want more of a sense of community because of the hero generation, which was nurtured, this hero mindset of rejecting the complete individual and trying to work towards a greater collective power to overcome this major crisis of what we are to come to. The question is, what is this crisis? And I don't know, of course, and nobody knows. But what the book portrays is that we should just be ready for a potential crisis, whether that be a war, a complete economic collapse, just any major event that will lead to the restructuring of American order, American politics, and American government. Nobody really knows what this crisis will be, but the way it's described in the book is that there will be a major event that's fast and completely throws everything upside down for a short period of time. And if this book is correct, this major crisis event will happen from anywhere from today into the next 2 years. Again, I'm not trying to project fear for the world. I'm just trying to portray my thoughts on a potential situation, because if anything, an interesting thought experiment to have of where do you see your life in this? Where do you see your life progressing? Are you comfortable? If the world does go into a crisis, are you happy with the actions you have taken up to this point in your life? Because we don't know what tomorrow will bring. And when I think about these different generational archetypes in my own personal experience, or from talking to my parents, or from talking to people in my parents' generations, I do sense that there is some truth to this, that people always strive to mend the errors of the past. And there's always an overcorrection from one way or the other way, where the next generation criticizes the way they were raised. My generation as millennials might criticize the elders for overprotecting us and over-nurturing us. And also, from a counterpoint to that statement, it is very odd to me that it seems like in media that the millennial generation is often criticized as being this everybody wins, every kid gets a trophy generation, when they were the adults who raised our generation to be like this, to be more compassionate and to be more inclusive on everybody, because we have what is supposedly a team-oriented mindset. So I don't know if we feel guilt from having this mindset because of what we're raised like, and then eventually this is rejected when our generation raises kids in the next 20 years. And then that generation who might be more neglected during their childhood has a sense of loss and abandonment that wants to overprotect the children again in a couple generations. But the way this is portrayed in the book is that this is critical. For a civilization to strive and endure, we need to have these cycles to recorrect the path we're on. Otherwise, if we're living just a linear path, then there's no consequence to actions. There's no thought about what I'm doing today might lead to what happens in 3 generations from now. This leads us on this path from misjudgment to correction, which is very interesting to ponder. When we look back at the unraveling period in this theory, this is the period that ultimately directly affects the next phase, the next quarter of the 4 turnings. The unraveling is what leads to the crisis, because there's a breaking point in the direction, in the sense of community and individuality. It is described that the unraveling enables people to live life to the fullest, consume off of the past, and pursue individual ends. To quote the book directly, human civilization would be far poorer without such an opportunity. One's per saeculum to explore the private realms of self-fulfillment, even if it brings public pessimism. In many ways, the 3rd turning or unraveling can be the most personally enjoyable of the secular seasons. All things on earth point home in old October, the 3rd turning or the autumn of a generational phase. Travelers to the walls and fences, hunters to the fields and hollow, and the long voice of the hounds, and the lover to the love he has forsaken. And this is where I see there might be a lot of reasoning and contempt for the boomer generation, of once was viewed as a free, loving society with a very big impact on their direction for the country. It seems that this prophet generation began entering a midlife phase, which might seem a little hypocritical to the way we view the hippies from the early 1960s. Where is this free love, sense of community that we look back and view on this generation that it seems with the elders today that they don't have? the spiritual journey that they were on very much led to this hyper-individualism that I see in the United States, which later affected people of younger generations. It seems to me that people have to have this uniqueness. Everybody wants to be super unique. This is why we have so many descriptions of people, why people strive to be their own self. Again, might be a little hypocritical on my end. Why is there endless, hundreds and hundreds of podcasts, people projecting their thoughts as if they're profound? And by no means am I trying to say that I think my thoughts are profound. I'm just trying to think out loud with a technology that is provided to me. And maybe in some ways will provide a secondary conversation to people listening to this. It's very interesting to ponder. I would very much love to have a deep conversation with a person who was actively involved as being a part of the hippie spiritual movement of the 1960s and how they view the world today, to understand, to see if there is hypocrisy there, or if it's just how we didn't really understand the spiritual movement of the 60s and how that led to the elder lives of today. Now, to move the conversation to my thoughts on my own generation and what could have been some of the early factors or early influence on some childhood nurturing, what I've seen on TV shows and media growing up, it seems that the millennial generation that I'm a part of is a direct correction from the 13th generation. It seems that elders felt like they messed up, and not that I want to put down the Nomad 13th generation by any stretch of the means, but it seems that the way we were raised is the exact opposite of the Nomad generation. This is a culture that grew up exposed to a lot of drugs and sex at a young age that it seems that our generation was sheltered from when we were at a young age. And this might be because the older boomers and silent generation who are running the government and country at this time realized that arrest rates went up significantly with the Nomad generation. It seemed that test scores in school was going down. Quote some statistics provided in the book. It says from 1973 to 1992, the median income for young adult males fell by 28%, which is more than it did for the entire nation from the peak trough during the Great Depression. During the same 2 decades, the youth incomes were plunging, and the real median income for seniors rose 26% during this period. So the silent and boomers' income was rising significantly as the nomads' income was plunging to increase this wealth gap. And this probably leads to why the 13 generation has a very skeptical view on the future. It seems gloom. Bills are getting more expensive and their income isn't increasing. With this thought in mind, was the millennial generation that I'm a part of nurtured in a way that elders and midlifers in the 80s and 90s that they didn't want to have this downward spiral continuing? So they enacted the DARE program to shelter us from drugs. I remember directly in high school where sex education was very much of, at least in a small town, don't have sex because it's horrible. I don't know if that was a universal thing or just a personal experience from being more of a small town culture. But the book describes that there are the 3 R's that nurtured the millennial childhood generation: rules, respect, and responsibility. Again, this is very interesting looking back now from my childhood because this is starting to be more of a prediction of this generation. Millennials will grow up to be social and team-oriented adolescents, but will strike adults as somewhat bland, conformist, and dependent on others to reach judgment. The book predicted that teen couples will become less physical and more romantic and friendly than they were in the 70s and 80s. And the purpose of punishing millennials will be to shame them, shape them up, and get them back into line. As a 28-year-old millennial in 2023, what are my thoughts on these words that were written down in the mid-90s? Well, I generally agree with them. It makes sense. The adults of this time didn't want to expose their children to a life of sex and drugs in a time with the AIDS epidemic and the war on drugs. These were the core topics in culture, and I am sure that this is something they wanted to assure wouldn't be exposed to the next youth of the nation. To restate each generation of where we are in today's society based on this theory, that there's going to be a major catalyst that should be foreseeable, looking back at history. Is this the COVID shutdown of 2020? Is this the start of the Ukraine-Russian war? Or is this the peak, these all-time highs of the stock market? We don't really know, but when the crisis happens, it will seem like the writing was on the wall when we look back and saying, yeah, we should have known that this major crisis was coming. It is described in the book that as the old boomer prophets, born in the aftermath of the crisis of World War II, foment the next crisis upon entering elderhood. The abandoned nomad children of the awakening become pragmatic midlife managers of the crisis. The overprotected hero generation will be the powerful youth adult soldiers of the crisis, and the suffocated children of the crisis will come of age as the next artist youth. So what do you think? Do you think this aligns with today's world and the living generations of 2023? In the next part of the book, I started to be extremely fascinated with the predictions of the millennial generation and the state of the crisis and how much I actually agree with. This is the current state of the world, where it's said that the millennials will come of age facing many debts, tax burdens, and two-tier wage structures that older generations will now declare intolerable. We're a generation littered with massive college and university debts. People are unable to handle credit card debt and get in this cycle of despair, and it seems that new taxes spring up at every moment. So following this theoretical crisis that we are approaching in American history, assuming all of the roles are enacted correctly, America will enter its next high in the 2030s. This will be the next economic boom that will push America forward. This is where we'll be back in the first turning, a new high, and the new social contract is written by the millennials and nomads and artists of the world to eradicate or completely change what has been the norm for American society for the past saeculum, for the past 100 years, all of the 1900s. What is a little eerie to think about is what the authors put in the book is if the crisis ends badly, that this might lead to the next authoritarian government where everybody becomes tribal and people will try to pick up the pieces for generations to come. Because the 13er Generation X will be the next elders who are rebuilding America post-war. America will need to focus on rebuilding infrastructure and institutions to blossom in the next awakening and mature in the next unraveling and then decay in the crisis again and again for all American history to come. But what is stated is if the adults during the crisis turning don't fix the budget deficits or focus more clearly on collectivism and individualism doesn't decay, then it's stating that the saeculum is broken and that the outcome will be far worse than what nature has in store. If we are in a crisis, I'm not too optimistic. People seem more individualistic than ever. In my opinion, we don't have the right leaders taking the country in the direction we need to go. The government is printing money on an unprecedented rate, and I mean, come on, the next presidential election is looking like a second Biden v. Trump. This is not what we need. So how can we prepare in a crisis that we are already in? And what I think is the most profound part of the book is how I think anybody should live their life with a set of morals and guidance. It says that traits such as trust, reliability, patience, perseverance, thrift, and selflessness will become the true hard currency in a crisis. And I truly believe that if you build your personal self around these integrity pillars of honor, then you will have a more fulfilling life, regardless if you think America is in its next crisis, because I think that these will be the most rewarding traits to have in your life anyway. If you feel like you should be preparing, the book is describing that maybe the person should be focusing on financial security, have money saved up, and cutting back on lavish lifestyles. I personally can say that this is not how I've been living my life for the past couple of years, as me and my wife have been spending much of our reserves in the last 2 years by traveling the world and not being a part of a cultural movement, but more on a self journey of learning and growth. But I am trying to take these traits that we're learning to hopefully will provide good and fulfillment in my own life of trying to understand different cultures from around the world, learning languages, and trying to stay up to date on this technology that's being built. We're in a crazy place in the world right now, whether it's a crisis or not. There is insane development. AI is developing at an exponential rate, and the only thing that we can do is try to learn from the people around us and understand the world that we're in today. So, do I believe that we're in a crisis? My initial thoughts are that I definitely feel an unease, but I don't know if it's that we're extending an unraveling period into where the society in America is today. Do I feel that we're on the verge of a greater collectivism and people are seeking community more and more than what we did in the 80s? I initially said no when I finished this book, but then I had the conversation with my friend George earlier this week where he made the statement where he thinks that we are definitely on a more of a community-driven society because people are trying to find their own group and tribe so much more than what we did 20 years ago with the rise of CrossFit. People are finding groups and running marathons, online forums of people understanding today's technology and finding a community and understanding AI, being a part of Twitter threads. So that made me question my own personal thoughts and reflection of the book where, yeah, maybe we are on a community-driven society where it's only going to get stronger and this hyper-individuality will decay. And maybe that will be fast or maybe I could be wrong. And then the last topic that I wanted to discuss for me personally before I wrap up this, my string of consciousness with my splurge of thoughts here for the past how long. Do I feel that the millennial generation is a hero archetype? And I gotta be honest, I do not feel like we're the heroes that we're sought out to be. I think that the nurturing was there, but I don't know, for whatever reason, it feels like our generation is still lost in this sense of collectivism. And I don't know how we would be the leaders of leading the next crisis, because I don't know if we'll be misguided or too individualistic on coming together. I don't know. Maybe that's just me personally. I don't know if I just don't feel like a hero. I feel like I'm still trying to learn so much, and the millennials are just getting older and older. But, we are also the generation that was the youngest people to lead the core efforts in reacting to the COVID epidemic. The 20, 30, and 40-year-olds were the people leading the front lines, working the day jobs, all of the nurses and the doctors and everybody responding to that mini event that felt like the world stopped for almost a year. That was all potentially held together by the millennial generation. Not that I had a big foot part in that response or that culture, but everybody was present, that's for sure. I don't know. I wanted to put this out there. I am still curious on your part. Do you feel a sense of connection with your generation? Do you agree or disagree that you personally feel that you fit the artist, hero, nomad, or prophet archetype? If so, why? I hope that it was interesting, to the least, of somebody who's made it this far in the podcast to ponder thoughts If you want to proceed with reading The Fourth Turning, I recommend the book still. Don't take it at face value. Just make it question the way you view the world and how you look at history. And maybe it will bring more thought-provoking daily interactions in your own life. So thank you for listening. Subscribe. I have more ideas for podcasts. If you're someone who wants to have a conversation with me, please reach out to me. And maybe we can have our own conversations to talk about life, culture, or the way you view the world. With that, share the podcast. Let me know your thoughts. I recently just launched a second YouTube channel where I am splitting up my main channel for my vlogs and my travels with Morgan, and I am putting the longer form podcast with Paper Mountains with Jacob Welly on his own separate channel going forward. So go subscribe on YouTube. Check this out. Not all of the podcasts going forward will be audio only, that's for sure. It's just a little easier to do and more effective to do, especially in this style of podcast where I'm just trying to state my thoughts and perspectives on a book review. And thank you for listening. With that, don't go back into the world freaking out that it is going to end. That doesn't help anyone and will get you nowhere. Go live your life, be happy, be patient, learn, earn your trust, be reliable with your words, persevere through whatever adversity comes your way, and above all else, be selfless with acts of kindness. I truly believe that if we follow these traits, the world will be a better place for everyone. Until the next podcast, cheers.